This handbook describes the various environmental conditions affecting human survival and describes isolated personnel, activities necessary to survive during successful evasion or isolating events leading to a successful recovery. It is the fundamental reference document providing guidance for any USAF service member who has the potential to become isolated. Deviations require sound judgment and careful consideration. This publication provides considerations to be used in planning and execution for effective mission accomplishment of formal USAF survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, SERE, training, environmentally specific SERE training, and combat survival continuation training programs. The tactics, techniques, and procedures in this publication are recognized best practices presenting a solid foundation to assist USAF service members to maintain life and return with honor from isolating events.
The more IP know about environmental conditions, that is, terrain, life forms, and climate, the better they can help themselves in a survival situation. Pre-mission planning and research of these components will better prepare the potential IP for land navigation, evasion, and meeting their other SERE needs. This chapter provides a brief introduction to these topics.
Terrain is defined as a geographic area consisting of land and its features. The landmass of the Earth is covered with a variety of topography, including mountains, valleys, plateaus, and plains. The mountains vary greatly in size, structure, and steepness of slopes. For example, there is as much contrast between large volcanic Cascade Mountains in the northwest United States and those of the Hindu Kush Mountains, Afghanistan. Most major mountain systems will have corresponding foothills. With two exceptions, valleys are formed as mountains are pushed up. The exceptions are massive gorges formed by glacial action and valleys carved out by wind and water erosion. Plateaus are elevated and comparatively large, level expanses of land. Throughout the Southwest, examples of the typical plateau can be seen, Figure 7.3. These plateaus were formed when a volcano deposited either lava ash over a softer sedimentary area. 2 years of erosion, the volcanic cap broke loose in places and allowed the softer ground to be carried away. This type of plateau is the least common, however, it is the largest. The Columbia Plateau of Washington State is one example which covers 200,000 square miles. The water forms of the Earth include oceans, seas, lakes, rivers, streams, ponds, and ice. Oceans comprise approximately 70% of the Earth's surface. The major oceans include the Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, and Arctic. Oceans have an enormous effect on land, not only in their physical contact but in their effect on weather. In most cases, lakes today are descended from much larger lakes or seas. Ice covers 10% of the Earth's surface. This permanent ice is found in two forms: pack ice and glaciers. Pack ice, normally 7 to 15 feet thick, is frozen seawater and may be as much as 150 feet thick. Those pieces which break off form ice islands. The two permanent ice packs on Earth are found near the North, Arctic, and South, Antarctic, poles. The polar ice caps, which are thousands of feet thick, partially, but never completely, thaw. An ice cap is a combination of pack ice and ice sheets. The term is usually applied to an ice plate limited to high mountain and plateau areas. During glacial periods, an ice cap will spread over the surrounding lowlands. Life forms can best be described in terms of vegetation and animal life, with special emphasis on humans, which are covered later. There are as many as 400,000 plant species on Earth. An in-depth study is obviously impossible. To understand the plant kingdom better, it is important to understand basic plant functions and adaptations they have made to exist in diverse environments. Vegetation will be categorized into either trees or plants. Of all the variety in species and types, trees can be divided simply into two types: 1, coniferous, or 2, deciduous. Conifers are generally considered to be cone-bearing, evergreen trees. Some examples of conifers are pine, fir, and spruce. Deciduous trees are those which lose their leaves in winter and are generally considered as hardwood. Some examples are maple, aspen, oak, and alder. For discussion, we will divide plants into two categories, annuals and perennials. Annuals complete their life cycle in 1 year. They produce many seeds and regenerate from seed. Climatic conditions may not be conducive for growth the following year, so seeds may remain dormant for many years. A classic example is the 1977 desert bloom in Death Valley. Plants bloom for the first time in 80 years. Perennials are plants which last year after year without regeneration from seed. As with plants, the discussion of animal life has to be limited. Animals will be classified as either warm-blooded or cold-blooded. Using this division as a basic, it will be easier to describe animal adaptations to extreme climatic conditions. Warm-blooded animals are generally recognized as cold-adapted animals and include all birds and mammals. Obviously, humans are a part of this classification because they were cold-adapted. Cold-blooded animals gain heat from the environment. These are animals adapted for life in warm or moderate climates, lizards, snakes, etc.
Climate can be described as an average condition of the weather at any given place. However, this description must be expanded to include the seasonal variations and extremes as well as the averages in terms of the climatic elements. In some areas, the climate is so domineering that the corresponding biome is named either in part or as a whole by the climate. Examples are the deserts and rainforests. The climate can be described in terms of its various elements, temperature, moisture, and wind. See Chapter 6 for more information on weather.
The atmosphere gains only about 20% of its temperature from the direct rays of the sun. Most of the atmospheric heat gain comes from the Earth radiating that heat, energy, back into the atmosphere and being trapped. This is the greenhouse effect.
Variation in air pressure is the primary cause of wind. When air is heated, it creates an area of lower pressure. As air cools, the pressure increases. Air movement occurs as the pressure tries to equalize, thus creating wind. Because wind is also a control of climate, people need to know why and how it affects climate. Let's look at wind in two aspects: localized wind, low altitude, and upper air wind, high altitude. Localized wind is formed at low altitude, occurring due to dynamic topographical features and fluctuating air temperature and pressure. High-altitude winds surrounding the Earth are bands of stable high and low pressure areas, cells. Predictable winds move off these cells, which are referred to as jet streams. These high-altitude winds control weather.
Thinking of the atmosphere as a greenhouse, it is easier to understand the relationship water has in this closed system. As water evaporates, the amount of water vapor the atmosphere can absorb depends solely upon temperature. The dew point is achieved when the amount of water vapor in the air equals the maximum volume the air will hold at a given air temperature. Lowering of air temperature creates condensation. Condensation appears in the form of clouds, fog, and dew. Any additional temperature reduction results in precipitation, such as rain. If the temperature of the dew point is below freezing, precipitation may appear in the form of hail or snow. The major effect climate has on terrain is erosion. Erosion can occur directly from heavy precipitation or indirectly by the accumulation of snow on snowpack and glaciers. Wind and temperature both have erosion potential.
Heavy precipitation or melting water from ice packs and glaciers can create deep ravines by cutting into mountainous areas. Broad flood basins along major rivers can also aid in the development of river deltas in lakes, oceans, and deep fjords. The action of glaciers throughout the years has carved out deep, broad valleys with steep valley walls. The effects of wind erosion are greatest in barren, dry areas. The Great Arches National Park has some of the most dramatic examples of the effect of wind erosion. This type of erosion is caused by the wind driving sand and dust particles against an exposed rock or soil surface, causing it to be worn away by the impact of the particles in an abrasive action, figure 7.6. Another form of wind erosion involves the movement of loose particles lying upon the ground surface, which may be lifted into the air or rolled along the ground. Dry riverbeds, beaches, areas of recently formed glacial deposits, and dry areas of sandy or rocky ground are highly susceptible to this type of erosion. Sand dunes are attributed to this phenomenon. Frost action will have a weathering or eroding effect on rockland formations and ground surfaces. The frost action is the repeated growth and melting of ice crystals in the pore space or fractures of soil and rock. The tremendous force of growing ice crystals can exert a pressure great enough to pry apart rock. Many scree and talus slopes are caused by this action. Scree is mixed gravel and loose dirt debris at the base of a slope, incline, or cliff. Talus is mixed rock, larger than scree, at the base of a slope, incline, or cliff. Where soil water freezes, it tends to form ice layers parallel with the ground surface, eating the soil upward unevenly. The peat moss mounds of the tundra are an example of this action. The net effect of frost action will be dependent on the amount of surface moisture. Moisture for most major weather systems comes from the evaporation of the oceans of the world. The temperature, location, and flow of ocean currents, combined with the prevailing winds, will affect how much water will evaporate into the atmosphere. The warmer the ocean and associated current, the greater the rate of evaporation. Since the currents are deflected by land masses, many warm currents float parallel to major continents. When this moisture is blown inland by the prevailing winds, the net effect is the creation of a wet maritime climate, such as that found along the west coasts of Canada, Washington, Oregon, and Central Europe. If the temperature of the ocean and currents is cold, very little moisture will be yielded to the atmosphere. Examples of this occur along the Pacific coastline of Peru and Chile and along the Atlantic coastline of Angola and southwestern Africa. The interior of large continent masses are dry because of the distance which isolates them from the effects of maritime climates. The large continents of the northern hemisphere create dry, high-pressure cells which isolate the interiors from the lower-pressure moist air cells and keep them from having much effect.
Mountains serve as moisture barriers, separating the maritime-influenced climates from the continental-influenced climates. The barrier effect of mountains on weather will be dependent on the height, length, and width of the range and the severity of the weather fronts. In many cases, a lack of precipitation will extend for several hundred miles beyond the mountains. An example of this phenomenon occurs in the western states. The Cascade and Sierra Mountains block a great deal of Pacific Ocean moisture from the inland deserts of Washington, Oregon, and Nevada. The Rocky Mountains further block most of the moisture which is left in the atmosphere. Only the high cirrus clouds escape the barrier effect of these mountains. Another example can be seen in Asia. The Himalayan mountains serve as a very effective barrier, blocking the Asiatic monsoon from central interior Asia, which helps create the Gobi Desert. Since plants require water and light, climate will greatly affect the type and number of plants in an area.
In areas with a great deal of rainfall, plants will be plentiful. In these areas, plants must compete for available sunlight. In areas where the primary vegetation has been knocked down, by clear-cutting, landslides, or along flood basins of rivers, a thick secondary growth will occur. In time, the secondary growth, if undisturbed, will become a climax forest. Some of the trees in these areas may grow to 300 feet. Because of the shade, vines and shade-tolerant perennials may sparsely cover the ground. In areas where the amount of rainfall is limited, the plants must compete for the available water. The number of plants will also be sparse. Due to the harsh climatic and soil conditions, plant life is typically hardy. Plants have developed the following survival characteristics. 105. Production of many seeds which germinate when water does come. Shallow root systems gather water quickly when they can. Ability to store water, cacti and other succulents. Rough, textured leaves, transpiration. Production of toxins, kill off competing plants.
Vegetation is also affected by the terrain. In mountainous regions, the clouds begin to lose moisture as they pass over the tops of the mountains. The result is more water is available for the growth of vegetation. However, with any increase in elevation, the temperature becomes colder. This exposure to colder temperature has a drastic effect on the plant life. Generally, animal life is mostly dependent on two factors, water and vegetation. The greater the rainfall, the greater the corresponding numbers of animals. Conversely, the drier an area, the less vegetation there will be to support animals. The location of small animals is determined by the secondary growth and ground cover used for protection. Temperature also affects the behavior of animals. For example, animals may burrow to protect themselves from extreme heat or extreme cold, or will be more active at night in hot, dry regions. Animals also respond physiologically to temperature extremes. During extreme cold, some species of mammals enter into a state of winter dormancy, hibernation. It is a special case of temperature regulation in which animals lower the setting of their thermostats to maintain lower than normal body temperatures in order to save energy while maintaining minimum body functions essential for survival. This is important since their normal food supply is not always available during the winter. During periods of excessive heat, some species of fish, reptiles, mammals, and amphibians will enter into a summer sleep called estivation. Estivation is a state in which the animal's body functions and activities are greatly reduced. Estivation and hibernation are not merely a result of temperature regulation but rather are methods by which the organisms survive unfavorable periods. Thank you for watching.